In today's video, we're going to be talking about the 5 common misconceptions of owning a high-powered Nissan 300ZX. So I literally just came up with this because I was thinking, and this car at this stage that it's in right now is probably just as easy to drive as it was when it was 100% stock. It drives like a stock car. It's fantastic. My only problem and complaint right now is that it doesn't have AC. Also, one more quick thing here. If you guys got any kind of value out of this video, it would mean the world to me if y'all went over to the website and checked out some of the merchandise we got. I got t-shirts, we got some hoodies, I got license plate frames, we even got phone cases on there. A lot of it's still 300ZX stuff, but we're working on getting Supra stuff and we're working on getting BRZ and CRX stuff. But here's a quick look at everything we got. This is my hoodie. This is kind of the go-to. Then we also have, I'm having this dream and they can't catch me. And then for the more generic stuff, we got show me your TTs, need money for project car, and built not bought. I will say the hoodie I have here is really freaking nice. I know if you guys are in the States right now, it's really hot, so you probably don't want a hoodie, but if you're in Australia, it's a very good option. It's a very nice hoodie. I honestly can't wait to wear it. It's just been 105, 110 degrees out here lately. We also have this style in a t-shirt form. So if you guys wanna head on over to billybuilds.com, check out the website. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you all for watching. Let's get back to this video. Okay, so number one, first and foremost, and it kind of goes both ways because, well, let me just clarify here. You do still need to let the car warm up, but it's not like it was in the past where you had a carburetor. But in all honesty, I did that when it was stock, and I just do it a little bit more now. So that's one thing that I will say that you just have to be more mindful of when owning any high horsepower car is the tolerances are gonna be a little bit looser. You gotta wait for the engine to warm up, like actually wait for it to warm up. Stock car, letting the car sit there and idle, it's a thing of the past. Back in the day, when you'd sit there and let the car idle, you'd have to wait for the carburetor itself to warm up. When the carburetor got up to operating temp, then it would run best or really well. Because back in the day with the carburetor, there wasn't really any kind of settings for a cold run condition, or there were, it was just very, very limited on what they could do with it. Nowadays, you can program cold start, cold run, post run condition through the ECU, through an aftermarket ECU, and the car will sit there and idle up to operating temp just perfectly. However, the main reason that you would want a high horsepower car to run and idle up to operating temperature today is because of the loose tolerances that may be within the motor because of the excess heat that it goes through when it's seeing that higher horsepower. Now for number two is, well, I mean, a lot of this could pertain to the drivability of the car, but we're gonna focus on some little details here that, you know, a lot of people just miss, and that is the cooling aspect of it. The cooling aspect of the car, this car with an electric fan and a dual core radiator will idle through traffic just fine on a hot 100. I had this car running through traffic last weekend. It was like 108 degrees outside, and it was going for about 40 to 45 minutes on the trip to my buddy's shop. And it ran smooth as ever, no overheating issues at all whatsoever. I was honestly quite surprised with it myself. I was very worried about it overheating. It was so hot out that day. I even took my little fan and put it in the passenger seat just to keep myself cool because it was unbearable, and especially at sitting at lights, like it's just insanely nasty. As far as like the cooling goes, literally just do it right. Pay attention to what you're doing. Get yourself a dual core radiator first and foremost. And number two, and this is where a lot of people get it wrong, and that's going to be getting rid of the mechanical fan and switching to an electric fan. Now, is an electric fan more efficient than a mechanical fan that comes on the car from the factory? Not necessarily. It can be, however, because you have to install with an electric fan, make sure you install a good, proper fan shroud. If there's no fan shroud on the car, it will most certainly overheat. you're gonna run into issues. You are not getting the full effect of the fan without a proper fan shroud. All that gap around the perimeter of the fan without any kind of fan shroud is not having any kind of air pass through it when it's sitting still. So you're just wasting space at that point. However, with a proper fan shroud and a proper fan, I like to use the Spal fans. Don't recommend going with the Mishimoto fans. They're not as efficient as Mishimoto advertises them, in my opinion. I've never had good luck with them. I will admit I do have them on the Supra, and well, even though one of them wasn't working, the car did overheat with just one fan. So I'm not a big fan of them. I'm not a big fan of fans. Oops, I had zero intention of saying that. Now, with the engine heat, you will see some extra heat in the engine bay in general. So be mindful of that. As long as you build the car properly and put in the proper heat shielding and ducting within the vehicle, you shouldn't have any problems. If you go back to my previous video, I actually installed heat shielding around my transmission tunnel and on top of my downpipes on the firewall. Downpipes were not in that video. I went back and did it off camera, but I did go ahead and do it, and believe you and me, that made a world of difference. Now we're getting into the good part, because this is honestly one of my favorite things to talk about with my car anyways, because it's something that I can almost guarantee you that no other 300ZX has out there. And that is, well, let me rephrase that. You can have something of similar variety in your car, and that is going to be the clutch. Now with a high horsepower car, it used to be common knowledge that you had to have a very heavy clutch or high sprung clutch. Like it'd always be very grabby, it wouldn't be very smooth engagement. Well y'all, let me get with you on the times here, because it's 2024 and there's a company called McLeod Racing, and there are plenty of others out there, I'm sure. Just do your research. Typically with a clutch company, a lot of them like to use the same parts between manufacturers. So let's say you want to get a good clutch for your car at X amount of power. I would literally go out and do the reviews based on other vehicles and then go back to the 300ZX and do, well, that's what I did anyways. And it worked out very, very well for me. If you guys want to order one, you can go on the McLeod Racing, contact them, and get your own if you really like. Let's get into the nitty gritty about the clutches though. First and foremost, you have a single disc and then a twin disc. And then there's also triple and quad and so on and so forth. It can get very excessive very quickly. But without going into too much detail, let's just compare the twin disc and single disc, because that's primarily what you're going to find for the 300ZX. As I said earlier, I have a McLeod RXT. It is a 1200, so it's rated for about 800 to 1,000 foot-pounds of torque, 1,200 horsepower-ish, right around there. I haven't tested it, and to be honest, I believe it's the same clutch that's used in other cars like the 2JZ, T56s, so on and so forth. Everyone I've ever talked to says they love it. As a matter of fact, I have a buddy down south who's making like 1,300 horsepower in a twin turbo Coyote Mustang, and he was primarily the one that ultimately convinced me to get it, as well as a couple twin turbo Vipers making about the same power. So if these guys are making a lot more power than I am, and they love the clutch and praise this clutch, and Grannis Racing, who does a lot of T56 swaps, loves this clutch, that's why I went with it. Let's say you have this stock 5-speed and you want to make like 600-700 horsepower, but you need a clutch that's capable of doing it. Well, there is the Specialty Z 5-puck sprung clutch. I had it, I used it. Is it the easiest clutch to drive with? Gotta be honest here, no. Does it hold the power? Absolutely. But if you want to actually launch the car and use the clutch, you will more than likely burn through it at the drag strip. So my suggestion at that point, if you're going to actually race the car on the drag strip or anything like that, get yourself a twin disc clutch. Now the beauty about a twin disc clutch versus a single disc clutch is the twin disc clutch in itself, there are 2 discs. So that's more surface area to clamp down on, that's more contact area for the clutch discs to ride on, meaning it can hold more power right out of the get-go. With that, you don't need as heavy of a pressure plate. Now with a lighter pressure plate, that improves pedal feel. You don't have as heavy as a pedal. And that's primarily the biggest difference. And that's something that me, honestly, I didn't realize for the longest time. If you think about it, it clicks, it makes sense. But the single disc clutch has a lot of clamping force, which means a lot of pedal pressure, and it can be kind of a pain to drive. Now, if you have a heavier mass flywheel, that makes it a little bit easier. That kind of helps out with the inertial rotating mass. But in all honesty here, you don't really want rotating mass. Less rotating mass means more horsepower that you can put to the ground, put to the wheels. And honestly, that's less wear and tear on the transmission and drivetrain. And that, folks, is the big secret to the single disc versus twin disc discussion, because in case you missed it, single disc can be grabby, it can be notchy, it can be very quick to engage, but it has a very heavy pedal feel, and it has to do that to make up for the lack of contact patch on the disc itself. Whereas if you have a twin disc, it can have a lighter pressure plate, meaning a lighter pedal feel, but it also has a little bit more give area where the contact is. So there's a couple of options that you can weigh out on your own, but I personally love my McLeod clutch in my 300ZX. However, I am also running a T56 transmission in this car. So do your research. I don't think McLeod makes a twin disc just yet for the 5-speed, but I'm sure if you reached out to them and contacted them, they may be very much more than willing to get one for you, as long as you can provide them with the measurements that they require. Now, a few other key points to note here is that you don't have to give up your amenities. Now, what I mean by that is you don't have to give up stuff like AC or power steering. Giving up AC is not gonna make your car any faster. Just throwing it out there. This is 2024. And in all honesty, what most people don't realize, or used to not anyways, is when you go full throttle in a vehicle, it actually disables your AC compressor. Your AC compressor is not running at all, is not pumping any freon when you're in full throttle. 90% of cars nowadays do that. The other thing, obviously, is power steering. Now, for the 300ZX, I will say that the ATI harmonic balancer does throw the power steering belt. However, if you mount it correctly and do the shim adjustment as needed, there is a shim that needs to be placed and grinded away on your power steering pump, depending on which model you have, to set the power steering pulley dead even with the ATI harmonic balancer. So that is something to look for as well if you're gonna be doing the ATI harmonic balancer to keep the power steering. That is also the reason why I went with an electronic power steering pump in the back of my car. However, I also just wanted to really try it out and do away with the rotational mass of having a power steering pump on the front of my motor. But that's up to you guys. If you want to check out the video on my electric power steering pump install, feel free. I'll put a link in the description or up here in the corner for you guys, and you can check that out. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and I believe this is number 4. We're on number 4 now. Number 4 is going to be the turbo lag. Yes, a bigger turbo can often mean a little bit more turbo lag. However, this is 2024. These cars were built in 1990, 1989. So with that, the turbo technology has come a very long way. And if you're switching from an older cast wheel design turbo to a billet wheel compressor housing turbo, not even discussing the exhaust housing packages or anything like that, the turbo compressor wheel is much lighter in that sense. Therefore, it will allow the turbo to spool up much faster and more than likely produce much more power for you at the same pressure that an older school turbo would, which is awesome. I personally went from old school cast wheel GT2871R turbos to G25 660s from Pulsar. Again, cast wheel, like 6 or 7 blade turbos to 9 blade billet wheel compressor housing turbos. And it is worlds difference. Like, these turbos make all the jam just as fast, if not faster, than my older ones. Actually, I can honestly say 100% that they make a lot more power earlier on than my old setup did, because this thing's a freaking animal at like 6 PSI less than my old setup was. Now, the beauty of owning a turbocharged car is that the power is there only when you need it. When you're not in boost, the car drives like a normal factory car, for the most part. And again, like I said, the lag is almost non-existent. The factory turbos, honestly, were quite laggy for me, at least when I got my car, and every other factory stock-ish twin turbo 300ZX that I've seen has had the stock turbos were pretty worn out. Either that or they were all just a little on the laggier side. The newer turbo designs make way more power than they used to, and they're way more efficient. So you can literally get a 600-700 horsepower turbo that'll spool up just as quick as a stock turbo would. So the fifth and final thing I want to talk about here is accessibility to the motor, or being able to work on the car. Does it get more difficult the more power you make? And in all honesty, it doesn't have to at all. As a matter of fact, if anything, the more factory stuff you remove, the the easier it should get for you. As long as you have that mindset when you're working on the car and when you're adding parts to your car, it'll definitely get much easier for you, not only in that you work on it more, you get more familiar with it, but also you're removing factory parts that you don't necessarily need. For instance, obviously I have completely aftermarket intake manifold, but it's mostly similar to stockish piping. Everything on this car was built and focused on the idea that it is easily accessible and I can work on it as needed very easily. The intake manifold comes off in literally less than 5 minutes. I can do spark plugs in about 15 minutes. It's not that difficult, it's not too complicated. When you're working on the car, don't make it harder on yourself. The more understanding you have of your own vehicle, of your own chassis, the much easier and simpler it would be, which unfortunately that takes knowledge and a little bit of time. But if you do the research and take the time to invest in yourself with the knowledge needed to do such things, you shouldn't have any problems at all. Now, don't get me wrong, because I have seen builds where it is just a cluttered mess in here. People will go and they'll throw every item in the book at the car without taking anything else out, or without even thinking about making the car easier to access and work on. Now, a couple major things that I made easier on my car for myself is, well, as I've already said, the intake manifold, but also the turbos. For many people, the main reason they don't want to work on these cars is because, oh, I have to pull the engine out every time I want to change out my turbo. Well, let's be real here. How many times do people actually remove their turbos? Right? Most people don't swap them out at all, ever. Now, if you're drag racing and you want to try out different housings, I get it. However, in this case, I went ahead and installed the Polar Engineering V-band turbos that are externally wastegated and dumped straight to the floor. So there's no recirc wastegate. Everything's V-band on the turbo exhaust housing. So it's literally one bolt and the whole turbo drops down. And then same thing with the exhaust, it's one bolt and the turbo downpipe comes right off. Very simple, very seamless. As long as you go into it with the idea that you can make the car easier to service yourself, your end result will be just that. Because not only are you learning how to work on your own car, you're also making it easier on yourself in the end. So by doing so, you learn all the little tricks that you need to get to that end point. Again, it takes a little bit of time and a little bit of knowledge, but that's why you're watching this video, are we not? In my case, I was getting tired of dumping fuel all over my motor every time I went to change out the spark plugs on my car, because I had to pull the intake to get to the R35 coil packs. There are two different ways you can go about this. You can either get everything above your intake manifold to where it's very easily accessible, or you can get everything beneath the intake manifold. I went with the route of, well, aftermarket intake manifold, but if I had to do it again, I would probably go with everything being beneath the intake manifold, because I don't mind pulling my intake manifold, which takes me all of about 5 minutes for this one, and my old one took me about 10 minutes for that one. So it wasn't too big of a deal for me to pull the intake manifold. If you want to get everything above the intake manifold, look up Brett Dempsey Engineering. He makes kits for above plenum R35 coil packs, and he also makes above plenum fuel rail kits. Now, if you want the other end of the spectrum where it's all beneath the intake manifold, you can go with Polar Engineering. Polar Engineering makes the below plenum fuel rails as well as the R35 coil packs with brackets. It's an entire kit. So go ahead and check those guys out if you're interested in one or the other. There are options out there, but those are just my recommendations. Personally, I have the Merlin Machining top feed fuel rails that also sit below the plenum and the R35 coil packs. Now, all of these are just really simple things that you can do and focus on while building your 300ZX. You can apply the same knowledge to any vehicle out there. Let's use an RB26 Skyline GTR, for instance. If any of you have ever touched or worked on an RB26 with all-wheel drive in it, you know how much of a pain those are in factory form. To remove the stock turbos, I'm not saying it can't be done just like this car, but you pretty much have to remove the entire motor to get the turbos out. And if you aren't familiar with the all-wheel drive stuff, you have to remove the all-wheel drive transfer case, front axles, just to get the motor out. It's not a small task at all. It's a lot of work. It's not as easy as they make it out to be. And with the RB26 stuff, you're gonna be spending a lot more money due to the RB tax. Now, if you look at it from the other end of the spectrum, probably if you're an RB guy, you might think the same thing about the VG30, but in all honesty, my personal experience, you can build these motors for much, much cheaper just because they are not as sought after as the RB26.